Your parent just told you that story again, the one about the road trip in 1987, or the time they almost got that promotion, or the neighbor who betrayed them 30 years ago, and you smiled, nodded, said something like, "Yeah, I remember," even though this is the 14th time, and somewhere inside you, there was this quiet, uncomfortable feeling, not anger exactly, more like guilt mixed with frustration, mixed with something you cannot quite name. Because part of you wanted to say, "You already told me this," but you didn't, and now you're carrying that. Here's what nobody tells you. That story your parent keeps repeating, it's not a glitch, it's not early dementia, it's not them being careless with your time. Your parent's brain is doing something deeply specific, and once you understand what it is, everything changes. Let's start with the neuroscience, because this is where most people get it wrong. We assume memory works like a recording. You experience something, you store it, you play it back. But that is not how it works, especially not as the brain ages. Memory is not one system, it is many, and they age at different rates. There is a specific type of memory called destination memory. It is the brain's ability to track not just what you said, but who you said it to. Think about it. You can remember a story perfectly and still forget whether you already told it to your daughter last Tuesday. These are two completely separate cognitive functions. Researchers at the Rotman Research Institute in Toronto, led by cognitive scientist Dr. Nigel Gopi, published a landmark study in the journal Psychological Aging. They tested two groups, adults aged 18 to 30 and adults aged 60 to 83. The result was striking. Older adults showed significantly greater impairment specifically in destination memory compared to younger adults. Not in the stories themselves, in the tracking of who received those stories. And here's the part that matters most. The older adults were highly confident they had never told you that story before. They were not being careless. They genuinely did not know. The researchers called it destination amnesia. Your parent is not repeating themselves at you. Their brain simply lost the receipt. But here is where it gets deeper, because the neuroscience only explains the how. The why is something else entirely. Erik Erikson, one of the most influential developmental psychologists of the 20th century, described the final stage of human psychological development as integrity versus despair. It begins roughly around age 65 and extends to the end of life. And the central task of this stage is not rest. It is not slowing down. It is answering one question: did my life matter? Erikson described this as a retrospective accounting of one's life, a kind of internal audit. Was it meaningful? Did it add up to something? And the primary tool the aging brain uses to do this work is storytelling, not writing, not journaling, telling out loud to the people they love most. That road trip story is not just a story. It is your parent trying to confirm that their life contained joy. That they were someone who went places, who laughed, who lived. The story about the promotion they almost got is not just professional nostalgia. It is them saying, "I was capable, I worked hard, I was seen." The story about the neighbor who betrayed them is not bitterness for its own sake. It is them trying to make moral sense of something that still doesn't sit right, and they are hoping that in the telling, it finally will. They are not talking at you. They are using you to do the most important psychological work of their lives. Now, here is the piece that changes how you sit in the room. Research consistently shows that when older adults engage in reminiscence and autobiographical storytelling, they experience measurable improvements in emotional well-being, reduced depression, and a stronger sense of identity and self-worth. A systematic review published across 34 studies on aging found that the most common purpose of storytelling in older adults was to support memory, identity, and self-confidence. In other words, when your parent tells you that story, they are not just remembering, they are rebuilding themselves, and you are the material they are using to do it. That is not a burden, that is the closest thing to trust that aging has to offer. So what has actually been happening all those times you sat there, half listening, waiting for it to end? Your parent was asking a question they could not put into words. Was I good enough? Did I matter? Did the life I built mean something to you, the person I love most? And every time you nodded, even impatiently, even distractedly, you answered them. You said yes. You just did not know that was what you were doing. Here is something worth sitting with. Psychiatrist Robert Butler, who developed the formal concept of life review in the 1960s, observed that as people approach the end of their lives, they begin a process of reflection that grows more urgent with time. It is not voluntary, it is biological. The aging brain, confronting its own mortality, drives toward meaning-making the same way a younger brain drives toward ambition. It is a survival mechanism. But for the story, And if that process is interrupted, if the stories go untold or unheard, what clinical evidence consistently shows is that older adults can fall into what Erickson called despair, not sadness, despair. The sense that one's life cannot be made whole, that it slipped by without leaving a mark on anyone. Your patience, your presence, your willingness to hear the same story one more time. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between your parent arriving at the end of their life feeling whole, or arriving there feeling like no one ever wanted to hold what they went through. Now let's talk about you, because this video is also about the guilt, about that flash of frustration when you heard the opening line of the story and felt your chest tighten. You are not a bad child. You are a human being who did not have the context to understand what was actually happening. Frustration without understanding is just pain looking for an exit. But frustration with understanding becomes something you can work with. It becomes compassion, not the performed kind, the real kind, the kind that comes from seeing clearly. You were not ignoring your parent, you were missing the translation, and now you have it. So if you want to know what to do with this, it is simpler than you think. You do not need to pretend the stories are new. You do not need to perform enthusiasm you do not feel. What research on reminiscence therapy shows consistently is that what older adults need is not someone who acts surprised. They need someone who is genuinely present. Next time, ask one question you have never asked before. What was the drive like? Who else was there? What were you feeling when it happened? You will not be extending the conversation. You will be completing it, because the story was never about the facts. It was about the feeling underneath the facts. And in all these years, nobody ever asked about that. Here is what is true. That parent sitting across from you telling you the same story again is doing the hardest work a human brain can do. They are trying to make meaning out of a life before time runs out. And they chose you to do it with, not someone else. You. That is not an accident. That is love, and the only language aging knows how to speak. If this gave you something you needed today, share it with someone who sits across from an older parent and sometimes does not know what to do with what they feel. They need this translation too.